Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Keisuke Iida, and I'm Dean at the Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm very honored to host this event today with Ambassador Robert Zoellick as our keynote speaker. Before we begin, we'll hear from our Executive Vice President, Kaoru HAYASHI.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Robert Zoellick, Ambassador Hisashi Owada, and esteemed guests, welcome to the University of Tokyo. On behalf of the University of Tokyo and President Teruo Fujii, who sends his warmest regards while on overseas travels, it is both my pleasure and honor to extend a heartfelt welcome to each one of you today. I am sorry it is a rainy day today, but our campus is adorned with the golden ginkgo leaves, and which is the perfect backdrop for this special occasion. And I am especially thrilled today to welcome Mr. Robert Zoellick with us as our distinguished guest keynote speaker. Mr. Zoellick has had a distinguished career, as you all know, spanning from serving in influential positions in the George W. Bush administration to leading the World Bank Group. As we all know, the World Bank is an extremely important organization for the people of Japan. And as we had had a fruitful and long-standing partnership with the organization. This relationship has been pivotal in shaping our post-war reconstruction and our journey towards growing into a significant contributor to the bank. Today's discussion on American diplomacy and foreign policy comes at the most opportune moment. In a world where the dynamics of international relations are constantly evolving, marked by events like the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza, understanding the role of the United States in this complex web of global network is more crucial than ever. Mr. Zoellick's rich experience and profoundly informed insights are not just invaluable, but they are also essential for us in these trying times as we try to form our own direction here. I am also excited to share that Mr. Zoellick's book on the comprehensive history of U.S. foreign policy, titled America in the World, has been translated into Japanese, offering people here a remarkable resource to delve deeper into this subject. This book, along with today's talk, is not just an opportunity for learning, but it is also a guiding light for those aspiring to make a difference in this age of incredibly difficult and challenging international relations. As we listen to Mr. Zoellick's speech, I know all of you are looking forward to finding great inspiration and new perspectives, as well as feeling a renewed sense of purpose in your roles as global citizens, especially for our young students. Thank you, Mr. Zoellick, for coming to our campus so that we may all learn with you. And to everyone here, may this seminar be a stimulating and enlightening experience. Mr. Zoellick, welcome to the University of Tokyo, and let's make today a memorable one.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayashi, for warm words. So before we begin, let me make a few announcements. First of all, let me explain today's program very briefly. First, we start with the keynote speech by Ambassador Zoellick. And then we'll switch to a panel discussion with him and some experts. Yeah, I'll introduce the panelists in due course, but there will be a panel discussion. Okay, let me just introduce our speaker and panelists. So our keynote speaker, as introduced, Ambassador Robert Zoellick, was the first United States trade representative under the George Bush administration. And then he became Deputy Secretary of State. And then he went on to become president of the World Bank Group. So he had an illustrious career, and now he's a senior fellow at Harvard University. There are three panelists who will appear on the stage later. The first discussant is Professor IOKIBE. He's a well-known diplomatic historian in Japan, and he has written a monumental work on the revision of the treaties. The second discussant is Professor Takahara. He's one of the best scholars of contemporary Chinese politics in Japan, and he'll discuss China-related topics. And the third discussant is Ambassador Hisashi Owada. He had a distinguished career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but then he went on to become president of the International Court of Justice. So he'll discuss the intersection between international politics and international law, and the role of global governance with Ambassador Zoellick. Okay, so last but not least, let me just make some sales pitch. So this is the English version of Ambassador Zoellick's work, America in the World. This was published in 2020, and it's really a comprehensive, monumental book on the history of U.S. foreign policy. And then the Japanese translation of this book appeared this year in 2 volumes, even thicker than the original. So I checked, and unfortunately they are out of stock at the Seikyo bookstore as we speak, but I ordered some more. So they'll be available in a few days at on campus, so please check. So without further ado, let me introduce Ambassador Zoellick and welcome him to the podium.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. And I want to thank Executive Vice President Hayashi, Dean Iida, and of course, first and foremost, Owada-san, who does us a great honor by being here today. And I'm very pleased to have the professor colleagues be able to join. And I also want to draw attention to my former college roommate, Hideaki Asahi, who is an ambassador and helped with the translation. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to come to Japan with the publication of the book. And I thought, particularly for a university audience, let me start by explaining why I wrote the book. When I was in government, I often drew upon history when I was shaping policy. And I wanted to share this approach with others, particularly those of a younger generation, whether in the United States or in Europe or in Japan, other parts of Asia. As some of you may know, Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s, where he drew upon history to talk about foreign policy. But being Henry Kissinger, he of course focused more on the European experience in shaping foreign policy. And one reason I wrote this book is I wanted to try to draw on the variety of examples from the American experience. As many of you know, for the students here, many foreign policy courses are taught using international relations theories. And of course, international relations theories are fun to debate. They require an intellectual discipline. But frankly, in my work across various U.S. government institutions and the World Bank, they weren't too relevant to the real practical work that I did. So I had an earlier opportunity actually to work with Ambassador OWADA in the Bush 41 administration, topics like German unification or trade agreements, North American Free Trade Agreement or the WTO or genocide in Darfur. It's not so clear how international relations theories will help you try to deal with the practical problems. So what I tried to do in the book was to write a series of stories to make it more accessible. It's not a textbook, it's not a comprehensive history, but each chapter is about a person and a problem and how people tried to deal with those problems in very practical ways. And I cover some 200 years. So the opening is with Ben Franklin in Paris during our revolution trying to achieve the United States independence. I taught a class at Harvard last fall where I used the book and in part to not only explain the history, but try to draw some lessons from it. So the world of Ben Franklin may seem a very long time ago, but the challenge he was facing was how do you move from war to peace? And that's a problem we still very much face today. I have a chapter on Alexander Hamilton because he was important in building the economic foundation for American power. So it's the theme of economics and foreign policy, which has been reflected in much of my career. I talk about Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States, but was very much connected to Napoleonic diplomacy and what was happening in Europe at the time. I have a chapter on Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward during our Civil War. For those of you that know something about U.S. history, this is about the same time as the Meiji Restoration. This was, you'll find many, many books on the battles and the social implications and slavery, very few on the foreign policy of the Civil War. But Britain and France almost intervened, which probably would have changed the course of history for the United States. So how did Lincoln and Seward avoid that? One of the other reasons that I focused on the first 150 years as well as the more recent times is when I was in my various government posts, I often had young assistants. And because I like history, I would ask them. I didn't know how much history they had learned. And I discovered insofar as they had learned history, it tended to be after World War II on. There wasn't much for the first 150 years. And yet, as I hope you'll see someday in the book, there's excellent stories about issues of international law, mediation, different types of diplomacy, use of force. And I think there can be lessons learned from this. Now, there are a number of stories that relate directly to Japanese diplomacy, and particularly from the eras before our countries became allies after World War II. For example, I discuss a man named John Hay in what was called the Open Door Doctrine at the time of the international intervention in China at the very opening of the 20th century. So this is what is known as the Boxer Uprising at the end of the Qing dynasty. I have a chapter on Teddy Roosevelt, who is known for many things in the United States, but in this part of the world, he probably would be more well known for the fact that he mediated the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, in part because Roosevelt was an early could understand the balance of power. And he was trying to reestablish the balance of power in Northeast Asia, and without necessarily having the United States be able to intervene militarily, as it did sort of later in the century. And it's quite an interesting tale. One of the things I used for my students was the different techniques of diplomacy. So this was a mediation exercise and how he mediated this process. And I draw a comparison later in the book because for those of you that have studied World War I, there's a little known opportunity in 1916. The war began in 1914, but in 1916, whether Woodrow Wilson might have been able to mediate a peace between the warring powers. And you can contrast how Roosevelt was quite artful in knowing how to mediate, but Wilson, frankly, was quite inept. And so you can see part of the story I'm trying to tell is the practical aspects of how one conducts diplomacy. I wrote a chapter on what's known as the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, and I found this to be particularly intriguing. The key figure in this was a man named Charles Evans Hughes. He was Secretary of State. He had almost become president in 1916, quite an accomplished person, served as an international lawyer on the International Court of Justice, as where Ambassador OWADA served. But his challenge, for those of you who recall about U.S. history, is how does he re-engage the United States internationally after the United States Senate had rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations? And while much of our diplomacy is focused on European politics, this is a good example of the importance of the Asia-Pacific, because he used the naval arms control negotiations not only to establish lower levels for battleships, but to try to reestablish a regional security arrangement. And this is an interesting example of how arms control and regional security often need to be considered together. And again, to give you an example of how this can influence more modern times, a couple of years ago, I wrote an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal talking about North Korea and recognizing that how might one consider arms control, not only for dealing with nuclear or conventional arms, but how to deal with the larger question of regional security. This is, I think, true in the Middle East and the Gulf today. The importance of understanding that arms control is more than a technical art. It has to be considered in the context of the regional security. Now, of course, this period in the early 1920s was a very important era for Japan as well, because Japan was looking at a strategy of cooperation with Great Britain, the United States, and Japan, really the three major economic powers in the world at that time, and focusing on a strategy of economic development. This was eventually was the internationalist diplomacy of a man named Shidehara, who eventually faced opposition because of the changing security environment, particularly in China, with the rise of the Nationalist Party, control of various territories, unification, and links with the early Soviet Union. And of course, the worldwide economic calamity of the Great Depression really shattered Tokyo's reliance on growth through trade. Well, again, think of the analysis even in your lifetimes, the effect of the global financial crisis and how these affect overall politics. So Japan, as you know, turned to a strategy of self-sufficiency and a sphere of influence for the Great East Asia co-prosperity. There's other parts of the book that also relate to some of the Japanese experience. I have a chapter on international law, a man named Elihu Root, who is much like Owada-san. Elihu Root was a very experienced official. He was Secretary of War, he was Secretary of State, he was a senator, but he was a great believer in international law. And like Owada-san, he's trying to balance international law with international politics, the reality of power politics, but also the issue of law. I have a chapter on reciprocal trade, a man named Cordell Hull, who tried to reestablish the trading system after what was known as the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, big increase of U.S. tariffs to an average of 59%, contributed to global protectionism. And in 1934, Hull achieved some legislation to start to negotiate tariffs down, but equally important, established the principles that became the basis for the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, in 1947, which later became the basis for the WTO. I also talk about the development of the U.S. alliance policy after World War II, which obviously is very important for Japan, for South Korea, for stability in the region. I have a chapter that you won't find in most foreign policy books. It's about a man named Vannevar Bush, who was the founder of U.S. science and technology policy after World War II. And one reason I included this chapter was because I believe that the science and technology issues will become increasingly important in diplomacy, whether it be climate change or biological security and pandemics. I was involved with the negotiations for the creation of the first climate change framework treaty in 1992 when I served in President Bush 41's administration, and again at the World Bank trying to get the negotiations back on track after the breakdown in Copenhagen. And I've learned some lessons about the sort of complicated connections between diplomacy and scientific topics that often have a longer range reach. Well, this is applicable today if you see the Conference of the Parties sort of going on in the UAE. Now, this history connects to the present because one of the other lessons is crafting foreign policy is a perpetual venture. And one of the messages that I wanted to try to convey to readers and students in particular is sometimes achieving imperfect results in a far from perfect world is good enough. In solving problems, when you solve one problem, it would often plant the seed of the next one. You think about this through different history and the different set of development process. But it doesn't mean that experienced officials and diplomats or students of public policy like yourself shouldn't try to achieve some good steps while they can in some of these areas. Now, in particular, the Japanese-U.S. security partnership and the deterrence that it provides will, in my view, be a cornerstone of the future. But in addition to the security relationship, the importance is that it's based on shared values. But the challenge will be, how do we adapt to changed circumstances? Now, many people use historical analogies when they consider current issues. And this is a common practice if you think about it. People try to find an analogy. But analogies can mislead as well. And my own personal thought is that I use history to try to ask questions, to get insights. How does President Putin view Russia and Ukraine from his historical perspective? How does China view the century of humiliation, and how does that affect their attitudes towards Taiwan? And for those of you that are interested in diplomacy as a profession or craft, it's very important to understand how other people view their foreign policy. You don't have to agree with it, but it's often very useful to try to understand. Well, today, many people will focus on U.S.-China competition through the lens of the Cold War. I served in the U.S. government at the end of the Cold War. As I mentioned, I was the lead U.S. negotiator in German unification in the 2+4 process, 1989-90. But I would caution about the use of the Cold War analogy in the case of the world today. The Cold War was an existential struggle between capitalism and communism. And they were two very separate systems. They were only connected at the margin in some very minimal ways, other than the fact that this had to be a rivalry that was tempered by the risk of nuclear destruction. That was the overriding fear during the Cold War period. But fundamentally, the Cold War was a contest of which system would prevail, which would be most successful. In contrast, I think the US and Japan and China share one global system. It's an intertwined system. The forces of globalization and interdependence are much deeper than they were even at earlier periods. And so while I think it's understandable that both countries will be sensitive to their vulnerabilities, and they will strive to lessen those vulnerabilities, and you see this, for example, in today with the diversification of supply chains and technology controls. You see it in China with the move towards self-reliance, the dual circulation principle of Xi Jinping. But full bifurcation is going to be extremely difficult given the world that we face today. Now, there will be variations by sector. So in my visit in Japan, I'm talking with some of your business leaders, and I distinguish the technology sector from the financial sector, from data, from other basic types of good. And frankly, from the perspective of the United States, our closest allies, especially Japan, but South Korea, Australia, other partners, India, ASEAN countries, they're not going to want to contain or cut off China. It's impossible to imagine that economically. So I think you're going to be operating in a world where the United States, Japan, and others will be competing with China within this system, not between systems. And that's more complex in some ways than pure competition between blocs. I don't think China wants to destroy the present system, which has served it quite well in terms of its growth and development, but it certainly wants to enhance its power within the system. I think China, in some ways, is reflecting its history of the use of a tributary state model, and it would like to try to have a tributary state model, particularly in Asia. But as you know, the United States is also recalibrating its role in the world. It's not an isolationism, but perhaps it's a narrower view of U.S. interests. Under President Trump, it became very transactional. So the institutions and alliances that I was often involved with, he treated quite negatively and saw everything as a deal-making. But in this context, the role of U.S. allies will change as well. I think there will be actually greater opportunities to shape policies. And I can give you some examples from Japan's experience. I think the late Prime Minister Abe was quite skillful in taking Japan and moving it in a role while maintaining his alliance with the United States and its complicated relationship with Trump. But recall, when the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade agreement of 12 countries, Japan stepped forward to move that and keep it alive. And now the Comprehensive Partnership of TPP. In my experience of dealing with Japan on trade policy, I would have never expected this because Japan tended to be the reluctant player on trade. But this is a big transformation for Japanese policy. But also, if I think about the whole discussion of the Indo-Pacific, originally came from Abe's discussion. India wants to have its strategic autonomy. It still lives in its post-colonial mindset. It doesn't want to be pushed around or directed by others. But obviously, it sees the rise of China as some degree of a threat. So it's a different type of relationship. But whether it's in economics or development, where I saw the very strong Japanese influence working through the World Bank, whether it's in environmental topics, I think that there will be an adjustment in policy. And this will be the defining aspect for many of your careers. I recognize concern about U.S. reliability. It gives me concern and pause too, particularly as we face a complicated election year. But also the events even in Ukraine and in Gaza remind that the U.S. role in maintaining regional security doesn't find an easy substitute. It's not that the U.S. can solve these problems, but imagine Europe's difficulties if the United States were not involved in trying to support Ukraine. And for all the frustrations dealing with Israel and Gaza, the United States probably has the most influence on Israel as any. Israel is a very independent country, but that is part of the challenge, even though the Biden administration probably wanted to focus more on the Indo-Pacific. They can't escape the demands of other regional conflicts. My own sense is other countries, especially in Asia, will probably want to maintain their own strategic flexibility. They recognize the economic importance to them of both the U.S. and China. I've spent a lot of time in Singapore. I serve on the board of Temasek, one of the sovereign wealth funds, so I see a lot from that region. And the U.S. and China say to countries in the region, well, we don't want you to choose. But of course, they do want them to choose, but the countries want to maintain some flexibility in their overall approach. And so most countries in the region recognize the critical U.S. role in security deterrence, the balance issue. Recall Teddy Roosevelt trying to reestablish the balance and security in Asia. But they have concerns about the behavior of both the United States and China. And I think in such a context, while the United States and China will be their most important actors, they're not the only potential partners. And this brings us right back to Japan, Korea, India, Australia, some in ASEAN, all depending on the topic. So this is an example of the greater complexity in the system. I expect we'll see more of what Bilahari Kausakan, who is a former permanent secretary in Singapore, described as dynamic multipolarity. And what he means by that is that he doesn't expect existing alliances or institutions to be displaced. But imagine an overlay that will shape the dynamics of those arrangements. And perhaps Asia, with its diversity, may mark the prime testbed for this changing system. But the change will be global. When I've talked about regional issues over my years, whether in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific, one always has to keep in mind Asia is part of a key global system if you think about the trade and the overall security arrangements. And so this will be different than the binary Cold War framework. And as I mentioned, I think it provides some opportunities and needs for Japanese diplomacy and influence. And as I mentioned, I think this was actually behind a lot of the ideas for the late Prime Minister Abe's strategy. So I'll close with a few comments on my book. The book since it covers individual cases, is really a series of stories about problem solving. But I end with a recognition of 5 traditions that I think have encompassed U.S. policy over some 200 years. The first is an interesting one. It's the importance of North America as a continental base to the United States. I'm part of the various boards of the Carnegie Endowment or with the Council on Foreign Relations, and you'll see studies of Indo-Pacific, Europe, Latin America, Mideast, almost nothing on North America. But yet the history of North America is quite important, and if you think about it today, notice that what's holding up the legislation of financial support for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan is the border security issue in North America. Or Japanese auto companies figured this out in terms of their placement of operations in Mexico as well as the United States. A second theme is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And the reason I draw this out is that many of us and many of you, when you study diplomacy or foreign policy issues, focus on the actions of states. And obviously they're critical. But from the start in the United States, trade was an opening for private actors to expand not only their commercial interests, but frankly, what people later referred to, and Joe and I referred to as the soft power. And this is true in transnational relations. So you can't really understand U.S. attitudes towards China without understanding the history of the missionary movement, which was very influential in trying to convert China, not only to Christianity, but sort of various Western attitudes, and how it affected the American view of China, because a lot of the authors, the writers, the experts were either missionaries or children of missionaries, and it affected the overall sort of mindset. And then there's the technology dimension, which is, I believe, will be increasingly important. The third tradition that I stress is the notion of the alliance system. And here, historically, what is so striking is that for the first 150 years, the United States avoids alliances. Sort of the founding logic from George Washington is avoid permanent alliances. And Jefferson, the third president, says avoid entangling alliances. So this was the history of the United States trying to get away from the European imperial system. And so much of the first 150 years you can almost see is how do you engage internationally without alliances? So whether it's international law, whether it's economics, whether it's other types of arrangements, the United States wanted to avoid alliances. After World War II, this changes dramatically. And so the creation of the U.S. alliance system from 1947 to 49 in Europe, and then with Japan and South Korea, has transformed international stability. But those alliances are not static. They have to keep changing. As I said, when part of my efforts in 1989 were to unify Germany within NATO. And that was important because we not only wanted to achieve a democratic, unified Germany, but we wanted to do it in a stable fashion to reassure others in Europe. And the 40 years of NATO was a way of assuring Western and Eastern Europe. Or look at more recently how Sweden and Finland, 2 neutral countries, have just joined NATO. And there'll be similar developments here. From my perspective, President Yoon of South Korea's efforts to try to overcome some of the historical issues with Japan are very important. I think the South Korea-Japanese relationship is significant. But as an example of a new development, you could see the AUKUS, the Australia-UK sort of U.S. arrangement, which is about submarines, but it's also about technology. It's about future security and technology transfer arrangements. Fourth, this is true in any country, but as I studied U.S. foreign policy, I found it even more so, which is that you can't have a successful foreign policy unless you secure public political support. And this is always a challenge in democratic societies. Publics have other interests. In the case of the U.S., people were weary of long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you can see the debate going on today about trying to support Ukraine or whether people focus on issues at home. So part of the challenge of political leadership is to try to explain to the publics the nature of their action. And fifth, there's a notion about the U.S. foreign policy should reflect a larger purpose. Some people use the term exceptionalism. That's not a term that I'm trying to use here. My point is that you can see how this purpose changes over time. And it depends on the international context, it depends on public support, depends on relative power. In the early years of the United States, it was simply to preserve a republic in a world of empires. There wasn't such a thing. For Lincoln in our Civil War, it was to preserve the notion of a democracy, of a republic, the last best hope of mankind, as he referred to it. In World War I, Wilson talked about keeping the world safe for democracies. He didn't say make them into democracies. He was trying to preserve the safety of that environment. In World War II, it was the four freedoms. In the Cold War, it was the leader of the free world. This will always change and adapt. But it's part of the nature of U.S. foreign policy that distinguishes it a little bit, since some of you may have been reading the obituaries of Henry Kissinger, from a purely realist calculation. There's a combination of realism here, but also a larger purpose. But the purpose ultimately depends also on the support of the public at home. So I hope you share my view that some appreciation for history in foreign policy today will inform your studies, even as we recognize that history is not deterministic, as the history of U.S. and Japan is a wonderful example of the nature of a relationship that has changed dramatically over the years. So our choices matter. These will be the responsibilities of many of you as students as you face these younger generations, and I wish you the best in doing so.
Okay, so we start part 2 of our program today. So we have wonderful panelists. So starting with Ambassador Zoellick, we have 3 discussants who are going to critique your book and also respond to some of the loose ends in your book, and we'll go to a discussion after. So the first discussant, as I explained at the beginning, is Professor Kaoru IOKIBE, who is a diplomatic historian at the graduate schools for law and politics. And he'll mainly talk about U.S. Japan relations, but maybe a little more. So please.
Thank you very much. I hope I am wonderful enough. I'm a bit concerned. Among those who stand and sit in the podium, I am the only one that is nothing but historian. So I'm a humble historian. So I thought I would be the last to talk, and others will provide detailed and insightful remarks before me. So my plan was to throw out a couple of bold and short questions. Now, I'm wondering what to do, but I think I would just do as planned because that would be more of fun. So I have 4 short questions and short additional explanations. First question is, what do you think about the world history? And the second question is, what do you think about the regional history of East Asia? And the third question is, what do you think about personal lives? And the fourth question would be, what do you think of the American Civil Wars? There was a civil war in the 19th century, and not a few people worried that there might be a second civil war in the near future, and that would be my fourth question. Now, about the first question, the world history. If I may regard the international order as a kind of single unity, the world history could be illustrated as the way the international order coped with its opponents or challengers. And the way it did it is usually the mobilization of the third power and betrayal by the third power. Take the example of Imperial Russia. The international order encouraged Germany to address. And then the Germany became the main opponent, unfortunately. And then the international order have to encourage Russia, and which may, in a sense, led to the First World War. And to cope with the Imperial Russia in East Asia, the international order, namely UK and US, encouraged Japan. And then Japan became the main problem in East Asia, which led to the Second World War. And through Second World War, the international order have to encourage Soviet Union, Russia. And after the war, then Soviet Union became the source of the threat. And then the international order, namely the United States, have to encourage China. And now China is a problem, and now we are trying to encourage India, right? And so that's a series of mobilization of the third power and betrayal by the third power. It may be a wise move because the international order could save its resource and time. I'm not sure that that's the way we interpret the history. Now, I have some hope about the future because as the third power, India is might be a bit different. It is a democratic country, I guess, although the freedom press or other issues in sight. And also, basically, I think India is a kind of defensive power. It may change over time, but so far. So I would not argue that that will be the end of the world history, but that might, if India works as the third power in the long run, and India stays as a democratic and defensive power, then it may lead us to the new stage of the world history. So it depends on how we perceive India, and I would like to have your observation. Now, the second question about East Asia. That's a region that the influence and the interest of the West hit their limits. I mean, either from the Europe, either from or from the United States. East Asia is quite far, and so it could be the venue of window shopping of the dominant powers at the time. I once wrote about the Japanese revision of unequal treaties. I didn't realize it was monumental until Professor Iida kindly mentioned to that. But through my work, I learned that the United States was very kind to Japan's demand of treaty revision. And the reason was not from security, not even from national interest of the United States, but its identity. United States is a new power ideal power based on North American continent. It's not polluted by European imperialism. So United States need to be kind to East Asia. And it also demonstrates the limit of the United States' benevolence because as the United States did not want to be involved in European imperialism, United States did not take trouble to persuade European powers to cooperate with Japan's demand for treaty revision. So Japan at first expected the United States, then got disappointed, and quickly learned that there's a limit of the American involvement and commitment, which leads to the second tragedy because in the 20th century, as the United States got more involved in East Asian affairs, when Japan accelerated its advancement to the Chinese continent, the United States was more committed to support China. At first, starting from moral support, but then gradually more substantial support. And Japan was astonished and annoyed because she thought that the United States is more reluctant to make an actual involvement, and at least for Japan, but for China, now there's a difference. So that's a history, of Japan's emergence and sympathy on China, and now we face the emergence of China. How now the United States? How do you see the change of American perception on East Asia? That's my second question. The third question is about personal lives. Now, your chapters, most of your chapters have the name of a specific person, and you illustrate very successfully. That's kind of book you can't stop reading once you start it.
Thank you.
You deserve this. And but interestingly, you don't write much about their early lives. When you write about Hamilton, you don't start from his childhood. It sounds like each person have their own visions and ideals, and they do what they have to based on that. So you don't see much distortion based on their personalities or early lives. And as a historian, I'm very curious about persons, including their whole lives. And so, my personal curiosity is, as you are very, you're a successful historian and also a successful practitioner. So when you have to make a decision as a practitioner, does your early life affect this or not? And if you can give us a couple of examples and observations, that would be really fascinating. The fourth and last question is about your American domestic politics. Let me talk a bit about the Civil War, American Civil War in the 19th century. It affects a lot the world, the United States and the world, and of course Japan. At the time, Japan had to open the country and start in a free trade with the Western powers. The reason Japan could do well and accommodate to the new situation and adapt herself to the free trade, international trade, is U.S. Civil War. The south of the United States used to sell cotton very well, and it had to hold because of Civil War, and which gave a huge opportunity for Japan because Japan produced a certain amount of cotton. So thanks to the Civil War, Japan found a product that Japan could export, and which gave a room for Japan to import as well. Then the end of the Civil War, the export of American cotton restarted, and because of that, there was a surplus of cotton supply through the world, which led to probably the first globalized depression, or at least recession, in the world history. And for neither the beginning of the Civil War nor the end of the Civil War, Japan was never consulted. So, U.S. Domestic politics matters a lot to us, and something more than you realize. So, of course, it includes the example of Trump, as Trump canceled TPP, and Japan took the initiative for TPP-11. And we are really concerned, how the presidential election would play out, and how that would change the atmosphere in the United States. And especially my question is that, is there any chance that in the future, near future or further future, there's a chance that the domestic atmosphere of the United States would be more favorable to the free trade idea? That's my remarks and question. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for thought-provoking comments and questions. So without hearing Ambassador Zoellick's responses to these provocative questions, we'll go to the second discussant. So we have Professor Akio TAKAHARA, who, as I said, is one of the leading observers of Chinese politics, and he's also senpai for me because he's a former dean of GraSPP. So please, Takahara-sensei.
Thank you, Iida-sensei. I'll try to be brief because I think Ambassador Zoellick will need about at least an hour to answer the questions from Professor IOKIBE. Well, first about the book. It's really amazing, the span, the scale of the time that he covered. And it's really a book that is full of insiders' insights into the minds and the processes of decision makers and the decision-making processes. So it's a phenomenal book. And I think all those who are interested in American diplomacy should read the book. And having said that, okay, let me ask a couple of questions. One is about what was not featured too much in the book, that is America's relations with what we can call the Third World, or what we tend to call the Global South these days. I'm not sure if I saw the word Africa in the book. Southeast Asia, of course, a lot on Vietnam, related to the Vietnam War, but the literal Southeast Asian nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, did not appear very much. So we learned that they were not really the foci of American diplomacy. But is it the result of that today we face the inconvenient truth or the uncomfortable truth that the United States is not so popular, or is very unpopular, if I may say so? That's the observation that I've been making in recent years as I go around these developing countries in order to look into their relations, bilateral relations with China. Often I come across remarks from my interlocutors how much they lack trust in the United States. And one reason why a country like China or even Russia is popular amongst not only the ordinary people in those countries, but amongst the policymakers, is because they are not so fond of what's being told to them by the Americans or the Europeans. And you know, America was a colony itself, but it hasn't really caught the hearts and minds of those who were colonized in other parts of the world. So how can the United States change this situation? And because this is a big question for an ally of the United States, like Japan. Now there's this intense competition over winning the hearts and minds of the developing world, or the global south, however you want to call it. And we need some change, perhaps, in the policies or the attitudes of the United States. And I just wondered how you think about this question. We have noticed that, for example, Samantha Power, the leader of the USAID, have started to talk about, language matters. I think it's a very important change that we would support. Okay, so that's one area of questions I had. And the second group of questions is about China. Your idea about calling on China to become a responsible stakeholder, I think we Japanese would very much support the idea, since it resonates with our policy, traditional policy of engagement, ever since 1972, when we normalized our relations with China. China's so-called reform and opening policies were rather volatile and vulnerable up to 1992, and the Japanese saw the need to engage China firmly and pull them into the order of ours. I think that's the basic idea. Well, of course, what am I to say this sitting next to Ambassador OWADA? But anyhow, I want to ask about the American engagement policy, because these days we hear that America's engagement policy was a failure because originally the Americans thought that through engagement we will be able to change the Chinese political system. But was that the idea behind engagement from the beginning? I somehow wonder, because your phrase, to have China as the responsible stakeholder, does not imply that you are hoping for them to change their political system. And I don't think the Japanese have had any idea about changing their political system. So I'd be very curious to hear from you. What is your assessment of the American engagement policy? And of course, the related question is about the future. How should we go forward from here as regards our China policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. And next, we'll hear from Ambassador Hisashi Owada, who needs no introduction. He's a well-known diplomat as well as well-known international jurist. So he served as president of the International Court of Justice. So we hear from him about the role of international law and U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Iida, for your very elaborate introduction of me. Bob Zoellick, who is an old friend of mine, has referred to me very often in his presentation, and that perhaps it's better to put the whole thing in the proper perspective. When I met Bob Zoellick first time, he was regarded as one of the three eminent, promising disciples of James Baker, who was a Treasury Secretary. He, of course, was looking forward to further advancement in his position. Later, he became the Secretary of State. But at that time, he was well known as a very competent Secretary of Treasury, and he had three boys under him who were known as Baker boys. And Bob Zoellick was one of the three. Another one was Bob Kimmett that I made a mistake of. But in any case, he was already well known throughout the world, and particularly in the bureaucratic world of the world, including that of Japan. So that's how I came to know him. He was when Baker became the Secretary of State, he became the Deputy Secretary of State under Baker, and I was the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs in the Kaifu administration and Miyazawa administration. Now that's how we met each other. You might think that we have been engaged in a deadly struggle, like two boxers fighting against each other. But in fact, the fact was very different, in the sense that, of course, we were representing both countries, national interests of the two countries, where interests could be different. But we had developed a greater degree of respect as friends, and since then we have become very good friends. And so I should be much more careful in trying to offer critical comments to his book. But this is again a different arena that we are fighting again, and so I would be happy to engage in myself in the discussion. I'm tempted to answer some of the questions raised by Professor IOKIBE and Professor Takahara also, but this is not my task. The book is a huge book. It's an excellent book, as Professor Takahara said. I was fascinated by reading the book, not because it is comprehensive as a diplomatic history of the United States. It is a unique account, unique book, in the sense that although it is not a very comprehensive book as a book of American foreign policy in the historical context, but it really depicts some of the most interesting personalities, and as Bob Zoellick has tried to explain, he decided to pick up stories and to talk about stories and personalities involved, individual personalities, in order to illustrate the points that he wanted to make by writing this book. And that is the spirit in which I would recommend you to read this book. It's an excellent book, as Professor Takahara said. I think it's a must for anyone who is interested in the evolution and the backgrounds of the evolution of the American foreign policy. Now, having said that, I should not get into the area which Professor IOKIBE has covered and which Professor Takahara is a specialist in. And this is not my purpose to engage in the broader discussion until, of course, we get into a more heated discussion including Bob Zoellick and Professor IOKIBE and Professor Takahara. But my point at this moment is simply to focus myself on the point which Zoellick covers in his chapter 9 of the book. I understand that many of you have not read the book, but if you get that book, please read chapter 9. This is a chapter relating to an American jurist and statesman called Elihu Root. Some people pronounce it Elihu. I don't know which is a proper pronunciation in the United States, but Elihu Root was a jurist, and he became the Secretary of State at a time when things were very difficult to handle, and he behaved very cleverly and skillfully, but honestly and discreetly, in line with his own profession as a jurist. And in fact, Ambassador Hisashi, who is here, always tells me that when he reads the biography of Elihu Root, the biography reminds him of me, in the sense that I have been trying to emulate Elihu Root. Perhaps emulation is too strong a word, but I can at least say that Elihu Root has always been my mentor as a diplomat, but as a diplomat who has been struggling with this dichotomy, if you like, between international law and international relations, or to put it more academically, the interplay or interface between the normative framework of international law as regulating the public international order on the one hand, and the naked geopolitical struggle as reflected in the international relations as you witness, and how you reconcile, how you try to solve this problem has always been a problem to me throughout my life in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. But also, I can see by reading his account of Elihu Root, I can see that he has tried to accommodate the two almost incompatible requirements, which I'm sure you are familiar with as a student of public policy at this graduate school. But this is a difficult problem which no one has ever has been totally successful, but everyone has tried to achieve this reconciliation between the two incompatible objectives and to see how things can be harmonized. Now, these are my comments about his book, and I like my predecessors, Professor IOKIBE and Professor Takahara, I'm going to pose 3 questions to Bob Zoellick. The first question I want to raise in relation with what I said about Elihu Root is that Zoellick emphasized the importance of pragmatism in the conduct of foreign affairs in the U.S. foreign policy making and implementation. Now I can see that, but the problem here is that, to me at least, as someone who has been struggling with the same problem, you can adopt a pragmatic attitude, and you may practice pragmatism, but it requires some ultimate aim to achieve. And what is that aim? How you define that aim in the diplomatic history of the United States? Now, unless you are able to define that, your pragmatism will lead you anywhere, which may not be in the interest of the world, not to speak about the interest of the United States. And this is a question that I have always struggled myself, and I could not find any persuasive answer in Bob Zoellick's excellent account of Elihu Root, and I'm interested in knowing how he tries to answer that question, because this applies not only Elihu Root, but with Cordell Hull, with many other Secretaries of State who are competent in serving the nation, the United States. But when you speak about the nation, the important point that Bob Zoellick emphasized was that popular support or the national support in engaging in the public diplomacy. Now, when the public differs with what you think is the ultimate goal to be achieved, how do you deal with that problem? Are you going to meekly follow what what is reported through media and through other means, the national interest of the nation? Is it an accurate national interest? National interest is an easy word to use, but what is national and what is interest have to be more clearly defined if you want to answer that question. And this has not been an easy question when you actually face the problem in the actual conduct of diplomacy. There was excuse me for my digression, but there was a famous phrase used by the then Minister for Forestry and Agriculture and Forestry, who said that not to allow even a piece of rice into Japan is against the national interest of Japan. Do you agree with that? Now, so it's easy to talk about the national interest, but when you think about the national interest, it becomes a much more difficult problem. But setting aside my digression, I think that's my first question about Elihu Root and his view about the practice of pragmatism leading to somewhere, and what is that somewhere is my first question. The second question is the dichotomy that we face at present, that U.S. policy has been based on pragmatism, which was not determined, but which was very much influenced, strongly influenced by the public opinion of the nation. And this was the fate of idealism of Wilson, which Professor Zoellick or Ambassador Zoellick describes as a disastrous failure on the part of Wilson, because who was so idealistic and for scholarly and ignoring the reality of the national politics in the United States, together with the world politics. Now, I accept his assessment, but accepting that argument, is it possible to practice, to engage in the leadership role in the present-day world, where it is not easy to reconcile what is in the national sphere in your own country and what is the trend of the world, in particular when the world is moving towards globalization. Globalization requires much more universal approach to the so-called issue of international public interest, whereas the national opinion, whether it is in the United States or in Japan, is much more narrowly focused and much more nationalistic in approach. And how do you approach that situation? Are you going to follow the national, what you feel, the way the wind is blowing in your own country, or are you trying to modify that by enlightening the public and enlightening the public opinion in your own country so that you could actually exercise global leadership? Now, this is my second question, which I think is a very serious question, and I'm now struggling with that problem in my joint seminar between Leiden University and Tokyo University on the question of interface between international law as a normative framework of international public order and the power struggle as reflected in the actual reality of the world situation. Now, the third question is an easy answer for Zoellick to reply. It's not one of those difficult questions which have been put by Professor IOKIBE or Professor Takahara. The third question is an easy one. I have always been troubled with how to pronounce your name, your family name. Or is it Zoellick as in Germany, or is it Zoellick as in Dutch, or is it Zoellick as in the United States? I'm interested to know, because in spite of my long association with him, I have never been certain about how to pronounce your name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. don't have much time left, so can you answer them in 10 minutes?
I'll do the first one first, Owada-san. I use Zoellick, but I respond to all of the ones that you mentioned. And the major challenge in life is that one of the last aspects of discrimination not recognized in the world is alphabetical discrimination. And growing up at the very end of the alphabet is a very psychological burden. So let me start with the 4 questions. One was how the international order operates. You may recall that as the Cold War was ending in Europe, that Frank Fukuyama wrote an article and then a book about the end of history. So his view was that this showed the dominance of liberal democratic systems and that they would prevail. Many of us at the time thought that was a nice wish and hope, but the reality of conflict that you would associate with realism and others was more likely to predominate. That leads to another order, and this seemed to be the model you were using, which is more of a balance of power order. And I think the balance of power order is frequently and usefully used in the area of security. But what I try to do in the book is demonstrate that if you think about economics, politics, transnational and scientific relations, a balance of power is not sufficient. And you have to consider other frameworks, such as more networked models, as we've created. And this will actually come back to Owada-san's point, because for those models to work, you have to accept a certain basis of rules and norms. And we don't have a criminal prosecution to force countries to abide by it, but nevertheless, I think it's in the country's larger interests to support systemic interests of those natures. You particularly asked about India. India, of course, is evoked because of its rising power and the balance of power framework that you used, but also because of its economic importance. I think it's important to understand India on its own terms. The fact that India was a British colony for centuries still influences their thinking a lot. They want to have strategic autonomy. They don't want to be dependent on whether the U.S. wishes or Japan's wishes or anyone else's wishes. And for those to make the point about the importance of history, I came across a book by a man named Guha called It's India After Independence, or After Gandhi. And it's a wonderful account of the nature of Indian nationalism and how it arose in this sort of period. So I think that India will be an important player in the overall system, but I would urge you to expand your notion of world history from simply balance of power order to a more complex arrangement. On the regional history, you mentioned the change in U.S. perceptions of East Asia. These perceptions were in part commercial, in part they were security, in part they were based on values. I mentioned missionaries and religion, but also democracy. The Spanish-American War, which is a chapter that I didn't cover, but John Hay was part of it, was quite important because this established the United States as a military power in the region. Before it was simply commercial. So at the end of this, the United States acquired the Philippines as a colony, and that's quite an interesting story. In some ways, McKinley actually didn't want it, but it's a challenge of if he left, whether someone else would have taken it as opposed to achieve its independence. And then this is when Hawaii also becomes part of the United States and also sort of Guam. This obviously starts to interact with Japanese power. And so by 1906, Teddy Roosevelt is now president, is in a sense saying, oh, I wish we didn't have a responsibility for the Philippines because it's a very hard place to defend and will create some clash with Japan. And speaking of Secretary of State Root, there's an agreement called the Root-Takahara, which is in a sense a U.S.-Japanese understanding of don't bother us in the Philippines, we won't bother you in Korea, which is a certain sort of security balance notion. And then going back to the rest of the region, the chapter on Teddy Roosevelt I found partly interesting, not only because of the mediation, but his appreciation of the balance of power, and that the U.S. would not fight, but it was trying to create this balance in the region. This obviously changes with World War II and the era afterwards. And so then you create this alliance structure, and as I've suggested, I think the alliance structure also is supported by the international economic opportunities created, and that's the system that is the foundation for today, but we'll have to continue to adapt. On personal history, all I can plead is, it's already a long book. I tried to put a little introduction of people in. I couldn't go too far. But I think you make an excellent point, and let me draw it out in the present circumstance. I don't think you can begin to understand the war in Ukraine without understanding Putin and his view of Russian history and his place in Russian history. So I don't normally quote Foreign Minister Lavrov, but on this case, I think he made a point. When asked about who Putin turns to his advisors, he said, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. This is how Putin thinks. Well, in Putin's framework, Ukraine is part of the Rus heartland. It has never been an independent and sovereign state. He's getting in an argument with Lenin from 100 years ago for making it an independent republic. And so what that tells you is this is a man who's not going to back down easily. This to him is kind of the heart of sort of the Russian Empire, and remember, at his age of 71, this is his place in the issue. You can make a similar story with Xi Jinping. I alluded this a little bit. You know, for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, part of the legitimacy after 1949 is restoring China's integrity. So whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Macau, whether it's Tibet, and so obviously this influences policies towards Taiwan today as well. On the U.S. domestic politics, it's a very long subject. All I'll just say is to sort of alert you that I think 2024 could be a very uncertain year of events. There's the assumption that it'll be Trump versus Biden. That's probably most likely. But in the case of the U.S. electoral primaries, they're often surprising. It's very possible that someone like a Nikki Haley could get momentum and Trump gets indictments, and so that's not a sure thing that Trump will be the nominee, although it's the most likely one. Even President Biden, we're in an unusual situation where the American public doesn't like either of the two leading candidates. For Biden, it's partly a function of age. And consider the situation for a man of his age. For in the next 11 months, he can't slip. He can't fall. If he has any dramatic event, people will be shocked on this. So I think it's going to be a very uncertain sort of period. And I think the campaign, unfortunately, will be highly negative. Each side will try to destroy the other. That relates to your question about the future, which is I don't think this will be a campaign that's discussing sort of future policies. Privately, I've tried to talk to some of the next-tier people in the White House to say, look, your bosses are going to focus on the election, but somebody needs to be thinking about 2025 if Biden is reelected, and there are a number of tax revisions that come off. But I keep pushing on trade, but I'm afraid the most recent U.S. position on digital trade was not encouraging. So as one of the last free traders in America, I'm frustrated by the fact that I think Biden's endorsement of Trump's protectionism is not a good thing for us. Professor Takahara, the relations with I like to use developing world because the global South, to me, as you know, the variations are so great here. I mean, if you compare Indonesia with India versus some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Just to give you a little added insight, it does flow through the book in a couple of ways. When I talk about the U.S. Mistakes in Vietnam, I note, for example, a Japanese author who started to talk about the Japanese development strategy and the flying geese. And in a sense, remember, the Americans were fearful that if Vietnam fell, that it would, the domino effect throughout the region. And so, in a sense, people underappreciated the power of the economic development model that Japan had started and Korea was then sort of developing and others. And then obviously I have a chapter on trade, which I think is very important to the openness and development. And again, remember, for about 3/4 of the time period I'm covering, most of these countries are colonies. So how am I supposed to deal with them as independent countries? But I'm working on another book about the world economy, and I have a chapter on development and others. But as for your larger point, to give an example of what a difference it makes, the second President Bush 43, pushed an initiative called PEPFAR to deal with HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. In many sub-Saharan African countries, this is probably the best thing the U.S. has ever done, and the legacy is still strong. And they made a similar effort with HIV/AIDS and malaria. Because of that, actually, I think both the Trump and Biden administrations mishandled some of the vaccination production, because I think this was an opportunity to demonstrate not only good public health, you need to deal with the disease all over the world, but also the support. I think that in my mind, also a topic that Owada-san and I are discussing, the private sector is very important in development, as we've seen in Southeast Asia. And so part of it is developing the set of rules for investment, for trade, for dealing with sort of other labor and environmental issues, so as to try to create a process for the private sector. So this is a little bit of the theme I try to bring into scholars. Remember, the transnational actors are very important in this. But I agree with you that the Russia attack on Ukraine led to a number of what I call abstainers in the UN, the vote, and I think that partly was a signal that these countries felt that they were being overlooked. And frankly, the World Bank has a new president now, someone I know and respect. I've been talking with him. I think this is a very important area to make as a priority, and it's a natural one also for Japan, given its experience. Your point on responsible stakeholder, I appreciate that you actually must have read the speech, unlike most people who comment on it. The logic, just to underscore the logic, when I was at the State Department in 2005, the United States, Japan, Europe had been promoting the integration of China in the international system for decades. By 2005, it was a member of the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the UN Security Council, environmental agreements. The point that I was trying to draw attention to there was that the international system had served China quite well. And so China needed to assume responsibilities in the international system. So I didn't say that China was a responsible stakeholder. I was encouraging it to be a responsible stakeholder. And in a way, another way to think about this is I was going beyond forms to norms, the nature of the behavior. Now, as you astutely recognized, this gets conflated with the engagement idea. My view is that engagement with China served a lot of U.S. interests. Frankly, I could give you examples of dealing with non-proliferation issues, or the Chinese work in the financial crisis, or frankly, they helped me in Sudan and Darfur with human rights issues. But the nature of diplomacy is it's never done. You can't rest on these issues. And so when you properly observed that people in the U.S. have considered it a failure, this, I think, goes back to domestic politics. When Biden was running against Trump, he didn't want to look soft on China because of the China threat. And so therefore, some of his advisors wrote pieces saying engagement failed. I disagree with that. I don't think it failed. But notice what's happened now. They spent the first 2 years of the administration trying to restore alliance ties with Japan and Korea and expand with AUKUS, and I think those are good things. But then they got into the problem that the relations with China kept spiraling down. This most recent meeting, I think, was to try to create a floor, but now they face the exact question you posed. If engagement failed, how do you engage? And for what purpose? That's the question that I think is on the table. I don't think it'll be answered this year because of the politics of the election year. But whether, again, as I made the point in my remarks, I'm not innocent of the nature of Xi Jinping and the communist regime. But the question is, can you, at a minimum, have a peaceful coexistence, and beyond that, find some common ground, whether it's on climate or pandemics or other issues. But let me give you a very practical example of the type of discussion I had with Chinese diplomats, even outside of government. I understand the Putin-Xi relationship. You probably know it much better than I do, but it looks like a pretty close sense of view. But as I've suggested to Chinese officials, how is your support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine in China's interest? So in diplomacy, as Owada-san knows, it's often helpful to understand not just what you want, but what might the other person want. And so China believes in territorial integrity because of Taiwan, right? So how can you support ripping up Ukraine? Number two, China doesn't like U.S. alliances. I do, but nevertheless, they just made U.S. alliances stronger. NATO is stronger because of this, and frankly, the ties with the Asia-Pacific countries are sort of stronger. Three, China's got some economic difficulties. Why would you want to create more problems for prices and energy and food and others? And the fourth one, which may be the most important, is China wants to have a good relationship with Europe. Well, the Europeans are not pleased by the support for Russia, as you could see in these recent meetings. So my point of this is, in diplomacy, when I made these points, I then said, look, I understand you're not going to walk away from Putin. But can't you position yourself to be more constructive? And one point I suggested 6 months ago is saying, you know, Putin's talking about use of nuclear weapons. You should dampen that down. And they did. Okay? Now, and who knows, maybe at some point, if there's a possibility of settlement, might China weigh in? So these are examples of how you can't contain or ignore China. We have to start with deterrence and defense, but that's the notion of sort of using your national interest in a way that can also cooperate with others. And that brings me to Owada-san's point. One reason that probably both of us like, I think it's Elihu is what I've always learned. Elihu, it's an old American or English name, is sometimes, at least in the U.S. discussion, I don't know the case in Japan, there's a view that international law is utopian. It's just theoretical. Well, Elihu Root was a very practical man. These men were not utopians. They were struggling with exactly the issues that you're struggling with about sort of a rules-based system, but also a power-based system. Your first point on pragmatism, requiring some ultimate aim. Like you, I've often pondered this because you're exactly right. You can't just be trying to solve a problem for the sake of solving a problem. It has to fit within a larger framework. The best that I can come up with is a variation of what I discussed with the first questions. Can you find a blend of national and systemic interests? So my view, and sometimes you have to give up a little bit of autonomy for the sake of a larger systemic goal. But if you look at the U.S. experience after World War II, this is exactly what the U.S. did. This in terms of trading the international trading system and the international security arrangements. And so, as a good example, let's in some ways the sad retreat of the U.S. from the WTO dispute settlement was that this was a somewhat unusual international system where countries didn't give up their sovereignty. They could, if they lost a case in the WTO, they could continue their policy. It's just the rules allowed someone else to retaliate against you. So this idea that countries gave up their sovereignty was not accurate. However, they were trying to regulate the nature of their relations with their sovereignty. As you could see with Elihu Root, even in the age of sort of colonialism, he was trying to apply those legal standards to deal with the Philippines and Cuba and others. He was trying to come up with what we would call a principled basis for acting. And frankly, he had another method which some people would sort of minimize, but I've always thought was fair, which is try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And he did this even with small countries. And he said, you know, if I were in the other country's shoes, how would I like to be treated in this? And this goes a little bit to your point about developing countries. I think these types of norms of behavior do affect countries' reputations. And so sometimes, you know, domestic politics or power politics overcome it, but it's the normative system that you start with. I'm sure you encountered this in some of my diplomatic experience. I tried to help countries address a problem that didn't look directly related to the U.S. experience, to the U.S. interest, but by doing so, by helping them with an issue, my sense was I was building diplomatic and political capital. In a sense, my boss, James Baker, for 8 years, people wanted him to be their friend, and they certainly didn't want to be his enemy. That's probably a good position, but also allows you to help others in the process. You then bring the point about the context of political support. In here, I do have a firm view. I do think it's leaders' obligation to shape those political views. And so we've used the example of trade. Again, one can do this in a democratic society, one can do this in China, but I don't agree with U.S. trade policies. I've said it here, I've said it in the U.S., I will argue against it, and I think it's a mistake. And as we see in U.S. or Japan, that's how policy changes. You've had big debates in Japan about the nature of your security position. I mean, I've mentioned the late Prime Minister Abe a couple of times. I think he was a good example of a very effective domestic politician using that power to reshape China's position on defense issues, on economic issues. To me, that's the real goal for a leader in the process. And beyond that, one does have to start with some basic principles. So there's a security and self-preservation that people have. There's trying to avoid major conflicts because of the effect on others. And frankly, in a sense, the theme of some of the book and some of my diplomacy is, can you create a context for mutual opportunities? So coming back to your question on responsible stakeholders, see, what I was trying to do was create a context where China could say, look, you benefit from the system, you have interest in the system, and if one goes back to the speech, I warned them that unless they assume some of these roles, you would have a harder time in the U.S. protecting the system. And so, again, to be slightly political about it, during the Trump years, neither the United States nor China were a responsible stakeholder. And how did that help the international system? So, then on the second point, as I understood it, was about the nationalism, internationalism. And again, my summary is, I think I've argued that U.S. nationalism and internationalism are two sides of the same coin. In other words, they are mutually reinforcing. Now, if you take a very narrow nationalistic view, an autarkic view, then you might disagree with that. But let me give you another example I mentioned in the book. When Ronald Reagan announced his presidency in 1979, in his speech announcing his candidacy, he says that the United States would be better off if both Mexico and Canada are stronger, not weaker, and it's time we stop treating our nearest neighbors as foreigners. That's amazing for a presidential candidacy speech. But he recognized that, frankly, it's in our interest for Mexico to grow, develop, have success as a democracy, obviously the partnership with Canada. And so this logic that you actually see in Secretary of State Seward, and just pardon me this slight transgression, but this is a point for Owada-san in particular. As you know, the United States was, in the mid-19th century, was negative about alliances. But the notion of union has really been lost in U.S. history, and it was almost a mythical feeling about, remember, they were creating an unusual thing. They were creating a republic, later became called a democracy, of states that were united together. And it was tested in the Civil War, and it withstood the test. For people like Seward, this kind of developed a notion of confederation in the international order. And you could see him thinking in these terms with other countries. And so it's a very crude, rough sort of concept, but the point is, can you develop arrangements with other countries that reflect, if not a union of states, a confederation of states, a cooperation of states? I think that's a very important notion for effective foreign policy, and particularly for the United States if it wants to promote its values as well as its security. And I gave you the pronunciation of the name. So did I get that done almost in time?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you for your participation, and please join me in thanking our keynote speaker and all the panelists.